Hi, I'm Clinton Jones, Michigan State University College Hall of Fame in football and track and field, and also National College Football Hall of Fame. We were national champions in 1965 and 1966. You're watching Duffy Doherty's Milestone Minutes with Tom Shanahan. Go Green!
Hi, this is Tom Shanahan. Welcome to another episode of The End Game. I'm really excited to have two guests today because they validate a theory that I've proposed for a long time. Oftentimes, when I do book signings or other events involving my books and talking about Duffy Doherty, people ask me, well, why was Duffy so far ahead of the game recruiting black players and ignoring the unwritten quota on that limited black athletes to a half dozen or so, playing a black quarterback, having black captains, playing black linebackers. Even that was taboo in previous days. And I always said Duffy never talked about it because he's not a self-promoter, and the media failed to talk about race back in those days. So we don't really know what Duffy was thinking. But my theory from doing all my research was that he was teammates with Wilmuth Sadat Singh, the black quarterback at Syracuse, who had to sit out a game at Maryland because of the gentleman's agreement. When a northern team played in the South, they had to bench their black players, and Syracuse caved in 1937. And Duffy saw that happen. On that same team was Marty Glickman, a halfback, world-class sprinter. He had qualified for the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, the Nazi Olympics with Hitler, and he was pulled from the 400-meter relay. He wasn't allowed to run because he was Jewish. So Duffy saw this happen to two of his teammates. And I recently came across a book, Invisible No More, about Wilmuth Sadat Singh and his remarkable story at Syracuse, Tuskegee Airmen, and it's written by Scott Petoniak and Rick Burton. They are my guests. Scott and Rick, how are you doing?
Good to be with you, Tom, and thanks for having us on.
Okay. Well, the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to watch a little video from a recent ACC basketball game where they showed the banner hanging at the Carrier Dome. I think it might have a different name these days, but it's the Carrier Dome to me, of Wilmuth Sadat Singh's jersey. And then they talked about his career and how it's something everybody should learn. So let's watch this little video.
February is Black History Month, and we wanted to share the story of Wilmuth Sadat Singh, his number 19, hanging in the Carrier Dome rafters today. He was the first African-American athlete at Syracuse. Sadat Singh played football and basketball for SU in the 1930s, and unfortunately he was subject to a lot of racial discrimination at schools that were still segregated that Syracuse would play, and they would not allow him to play in those games. After SU, Sadat Singh bravely enlisted as a fighter pilot with the renowned Tuskegee Airmen during World War II, and unfortunately he died at the young age of 25 during a training mission, but his legacy, that number 19, still strong today. Malcolm Huckabee, General, with you. It's such a powerful story. Wilmuth Sadat Singh, his bravery, not only during Syracuse when he suffered from so much racial bias, but also to go on and serve the military with the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II.
Well, simply put, I want to say thank you. Thank you for the sacrifices that he made and what he did, paving the way for so many that came after. Simply a remarkable story. I would highly recommend anybody that does not know about it, go look up, read about it. Certainly just all around a phenomenal story.
So in 2005, Syracuse welcomed some living family members back to the Carrier Dome to hang and honor that number 19 in the Carrier Dome. Former athletic director Daryl Gross there to make that happen.
Scott and Rick, tell us why this is an important story that is largely unknown, and it should be a major story in college football integration's progress, and also why you chose to make it a historical novel.
I think, Milestone Singh was a hero on so many levels, really a multi-layered story. Like Rick and I like to say that he was the greatest athlete you never heard of, and so much more. And by that, he was a black quarterback at a predominantly white university back in the 1930s for Syracuse University, at a time where there were very few aspects of our society or groups where a black man was giving orders to whites. So there's a significance there, and we're in this golden era of black quarterbacks. Well, all these guys stand on the shoulder pads of Wilmot Sidat Singh, who was compared back in the day to Sammy Baugh and Sid Luckman, which would be the equivalent of saying like Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes today. That's how big he was in the eyes of the most important influencer in the media, and that would be Grantland Rice, a sports writer. So there's a sports aspect of it, but there's also the fact that he was a scholar. He was a pre-med student, wanted to be a doctor, following in his stepfather's footsteps. And he was a patriot who wound up giving his life for his country as a Tuskegee Airman when he was killed there, and in a training thing. So there's so many different elements here to this man that makes this such a spectacular story. And I think part of it, again, thinking of why it matters, I'm a firm believer, and I know Rick is as well, is like the people who came before us, the pioneers. History doesn't happen, life doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are people who paved the way for all of us. And this guy's story has gotten lost in history, unfortunately.
Yeah. Rick.
Yeah, I'd echo everything that Scott just said. It's a great untold story, and we titled our book "Invisible No More," in large part because Wilmoth is not talked about. And I think when there are fans in the JMA Wireless Dome and they look up in the rafters and they see all the great names that kind of are hanging there, Carmelo Anthony and Sherman Douglas, and the list goes on, and they see in the basketball section, they see a name, Sidat Singh, and they're just not familiar with it. And what's interesting is Sidat Singh played both basketball and football. I think he was probably more prominent as a football player, and he's a trailblazer. Scott often points out when we're interviewed that he was really Jackie Robinson 10 years ahead of Robinson's arrival in Major League Baseball, or even playing football for UCLA. And so in that way, I think of Sidat Singh as really a civil rights pioneer, and that ties very much into what we tried to put across in our book.
Yeah, and it needs to be emphasized here, the media avoided race. They did not write about it. That's one reason Sidat Singh is lost to history. And if you go back and look at when Jackie Robinson made his debut in 1947, there was barely any mention of this transformative moment. It was the stories were focused on the game, and this continued into the 60s, which is why Duffy Daugherty's Milestone teams are lost to history. So this lack of reporting in those days led to the historical novel aspect you guys took, which is really well done. I wasn't sure when I started reading it, and I really enjoyed it. Talk about the historical novel aspect.
Rick and I, Tom, would have preferred to write this as a biography. But as you mentioned, the coverage of, particularly in the mainstream media, I should point out, coverage of black athletes was nil.
Right.
And for the most part, now that changed over time, obviously. But so there's not even culling, going through all the old black newspapers, which were prominent in America and in the African American community during those days. There wasn't a lot of Wilmoth on the record, so to speak. And if it was, there were quotes about a game, maybe there might be a passing quote here or there. So we didn't have a lot there, and we really wanted to get inside his mind and his soul. And so we needed to create dialogue. We needed to create some characters as well. But I should point out that we did an incredible amount of research over the years to try to piece together what we could and make this historically accurate. So that was we created as we call them, their parallel protagonists. Obviously, Wilmuth Siddhat Singh, unfortunately, he dies in this training accident in 1943 and then disappears. So we needed a vehicle, a literary vehicle in which we could put this into a modern context. And that's when we created the Black female sports writer who stumbles upon this incredible story, this lost history story. And it obviously means an incredible amount to her because, again, with that parallel construction, the things that she is dealing with as a Black female sports writer, she can relate to on a deeper level than others would to what Wilmuth had to deal with. And again, I spoke, Wilmuth was not allowed to live on campus. There was just a handful of Black students at Syracuse University at the time. So we decided to go in that direction. And, Rick and I, our background, we're journalists. So we're used to quoting people factually. And Rick has background and he had written 2 novels previous to this one. So I told Rick, this is so liberating because I can make quotes up now and make people up and characteristics and anyway. But that's why we kind of went in that direction.
Yeah, Tom, there's one thing that we probably failed to bring out here in this part of the interview, and that is that while both of Siddhat Singh's parents were Black, his birth father died. His mother remarried a gentleman from India, the country,
Right.
and that gentleman adopted Siddhat Singh, who then took his stepfather's name and then became Wilmuth Siddhat Singh. And ultimately, while he is a star player in New York City as a basketball player, when he gets up to Syracuse University, he's treated as what the language of the day was as a Hindu.
Yeah.
He was treated as someone being from India. And the racism of the day, strangely and perplexing in some ways to Scott and I, is that it was all right for Siddhat Singh to play for Syracuse as someone from India, but it would not have been as okay for someone who was Black. And Siddhat Singh was Black, and he knew he was Black. And so ultimately, what we go along in the Maryland game that you referenced is a point at which Siddhat Singh is passing as Indian, and passing is a concept that had existed in the 20s and 30s. And ultimately, the Black media, Sam Lacey, who will ultimately play a large role with Jackie Robinson, Sam Lacey outs Siddhat Singh to benefit the Black community, that this is a great Black athlete, a superstar who is leading Syracuse to victory and playing what today we would call the quarterback position. But that adds this rich texture to the story because Wilmuth is on campus in his early days passing as somebody he is not.
Yeah. That brings us to the game day in your book. And the coaches, Sam Lacey has written about Wilmuth Siddhat Singh and exposed him as being Black. And then Maryland says he can't play, and Syracuse goes along with it. And in your book, you have the coach telling the team that Siddhat Singh can't play. And you quote Duffy Doherty saying, "What do you mean he can't play? There's nothing wrong with him." And you use the word shouting, if I recall correctly. So you have Duffy's place correct in this story. Talk about how you fit Duffy in with his attitude of support.
Yes. Duffy is a teammate and a friend of 2 men who are discriminated on the basis, one on the basis of race and the other on the basis of religion. And so, again, he's friends with these people, and he can't understand, again, why this isn't based on a meritocracy, based on ability, but rather it's based on these external things. And so From talking to different people, again, I freely admit, I never had an opportunity to interview Duffy Daugherty. I wish I had. He's one of those people, if I could go back, there's so many things I would like to ask him about. But based on our research, talking to different people and so forth, he was profoundly influenced by this. And I think there's a third person, Tom, that we should mention in the Duffy Daugherty story here, not only Wilma Sidat Singh and Marty Glickman, but I think, Roy Simmons Sr. is yet another person who's kind of not received his historical due. And Roy Simmons Sr. was a star athlete, quarterback for a Syracuse football team back in the 20s that wound up beating a Nebraska team, which was the only team to beat the Four Horsemen in Notre Dame. And Syracuse was a real glory time for Syracuse football, and later became a coach for decades. He coached boxing. He was an assistant football coach, even on the right up to Ben Schwartzwalter's 1959 championship team. He coached some other sports, and he discovered Wilma Sidat Singh walking across campus one day because Wilmoth had come to Syracuse as a basketball player, as Rick mentioned, and he sees this kid throw, these footballs that were like medicine balls back then. They weren't aerodynamic, 60 yards for a touchdown in an intramural game, on the quad. And all of a sudden, like, whoa, I got to go see who this guy is. But getting back to Roy Simmons, Roy was very much a progressive thinker, way ahead of his time. And he played a very big role in, years later when Jim Brown was on campus and really, being the sixth string running back for no other reason that he was black, and Jim Brown's getting ready to leave. He's going to leave Syracuse, and Roy Simmons talked him out of it. And I talked to Jim Brown about Roy Simmons, and he calls him a father figure, and he was a man with a huge heart and a man who was colorblind. And so I think that, Duffy Daugherty was coached also by Roy Simmons Sr. So I think there's three people there that had a profound influence on his view of the world. And let's not forget that, even this 1930s, there's discrimination against Irish Americans still going on, as well. So he certainly has not faced it to the extent that Wilmoth faced it because of race, or Marty Glickman faced it because of religion. But he was exposed to it too. And growing up in Tipperary Hill, which was where my father was from, that area in Syracuse, there was, a lot of stuff that Irish Americans were still going through in the 1930s, and Catholics were going through as well.
Yeah. And one of the other points I want to bring up that relates to this is Duffy Daugherty started Jimmy Ray as a quarterback. And Jimmy Ray was the South's first black quarterback to win a national title. He was recruited on the Underground Railroad out of segregated Fayetteville, North Carolina. Black and white kids alike don't understand how recent segregation was. It's recent history, not ancient. And one of Jimmy's inspirations to try to play in the Big Ten was when we saw Sandy Stevens, the Minnesota quarterback, in the Rose Bowl. He didn't know he was black until he saw him on TV, and he was introduced. And in those days, the camera had a close-up of the face as they came out of the tunnel. And he started thinking he could play in the Big Ten. Well, Sandy Stevens is from Uniontown, Pennsylvania. So he's known as the first black quarterback to win a national title. And I was doing this research, and I started thinking, well, wait a minute, there's not that much time between 1960 and 1965 and 66 when the Spartans won shares of national titles. They said, I didn't need an encyclopedia to figure out there weren't many other black quarterbacks between 60 and 65. And I presented that to Jimmy, that he was the first black quarterback from the South to win a national title. And as an example of the media did not care about these milestones that Duffy was setting with his 1960s teams, Jimmy didn't know it. I ran it by the National Football Foundation, and Phil Marwell got back to me and he said, "You're right." And they included it in the newsletter. So that's an example of how much is lost to history. And I bring up Jimmy Ray because he escapes segregation to Michigan State in 1964. And he gets there to Michigan State, and he's a scared freshman like any of us were. And he sees this portrait of Gideon Smith, Michigan State's first black player in 1913 through 1915. Michigan State was a small agricultural college. Michigan was already a national powerhouse, and Michigan State beat Michigan for the first time. They actually beat him twice with Gideon Smith. So he has a portrait up there, and Jimmy sees that, and he says, "Whoa, if he can do this in 1913 to 1915, I can do it in the 1960s." So that was a great inspiration for him. And as you said earlier, there are so many people standing on the shoulders of Wilma Sadat Singh, and then in the 60s, Bob Grant at Wake Forest, Jerry Levias at Southern Methodist, Warren McVeigh at Houston, all of Duffy Doherty's teams. Just talk about how we need to do a better job of explaining college football's evolution. It was not an overnight experience with Bear Bryant in 1970. Like everything else racial in America, it's a long process, and it took decades to tell. Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll go first. I think Scott probably can give you more, but he mentioned Grantland Rice earlier, and Sadat Singh leads Syracuse over the defending national champions, Cornell. And Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 1938. And ultimately, Syracuse will win the game. Sadat Singh will throw 3 fourth quarter touchdowns to upset the Big Red. Syracuse will never achieve a first down in the game. They will only get 3 touchdowns. And Grantland Rice is there really to cover Cornell, ends up writing his story about Sadat Singh. And race is really largely not a part of the story, as you mentioned, Tom, earlier. But my recollection suggests that he talks about Sadat Singh as a Hindu. And I think that sometimes where you want to trace the evolution of college football and how it evolved, and Duffy's a key part of it, but I think we're going to give Scott and I some credit to Ben Schwartzwalder, who comes into Syracuse in 1949, and his first 2 quarterbacks in 49, 50, 51 are also black quarterbacks. And Duffy would have been aware of that. And I think he would have seen that a change was coming. So let me stop there and see what Scott wants to add.
Backs was Bernie Custis, who wound up having to go to, he was drafted by the Cleveland Browns. Otto Graham was there. So where are you going? One of the greatest quarterbacks of all time was already there. But there was also, this feeling a black is not playing quarterback in the NFL at the time. They had just integrated the game overall just recently from there. But, Bernie Custis winds up going north of the border, plays in the Canadian Football League, and he is the first African-American professional quarterback in the history of football. So there's that. And Rick and I later on, there was we obviously, of Donovan McNabb and what he did at Syracuse, and then also what he did with the Philadelphia Eagles. He was part of that whole lineage of the black quarterback and the evolution of the black quarterback. We had Don McPherson, who led an undefeated Syracuse team here and should have won the Heisman Trophy, lost out to Tim Brown of Notre Dame, but that's a story for a podcast for another day. But nonetheless, he was, the Davey O'Brien Award winner and so forth. But Rick and I went through, and there was a period of time, Rick, I want to say like from the mid-1980s through the mid-2000s, Syracuse had more starting black quarterbacks than any of the Power 5, Power 4, whatever powers you want to use, quarterbacks out there, any program by far. And kind of led the way in other schools. Then this kind of opened things up. Like when they saw the success that Syracuse was having, I think that opened eyes of many people and so forth. So, it's important to have these types of role models, and it's important again for us to remember them. Now, Rick and I are friends with Don McPherson. Rick's done a lot of work with him. He's still very prominent at Syracuse University, involved in a lot of things. And but Don will admit he showed up on campus. He had never heard about Wilma Sadat Singh.
Yeah.
and it really wasn't until later. And it's interesting too. We can give a little shout out to the late Dick McPherson, the famous coach here at Syracuse, successful coach, highly successful. In that, Don McPherson grows up on Long Island, a huge Penn State fan, and apparently when he was being recruited, Don was pretty forthright. He was gonna recruit you too. You weren't just recruiting him, and so he asked every school he went to that was going to offer him a scholarship. Like, not only, do you have a problem with a black playing quarterback for you? And this is in the, early 80s, early to mid 80s. And do you have any history of a black quarterback? And when it wasn't Joe Paterno, but it was one of his prime recruiters who was hemming and hawing and didn't really know. And all of a sudden, this kid who grew up and was all set to play at Penn State said, they're off my list. And then when he talks to Dick McPherson, Dick, essentially said, I don't care if you're pink with polka dots or whatever. If you can play and you can help me win, you're my guy. And that was kind of sealed the deal.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I didn't know the story about the Canadian first pro quarterback in the Canadian Football League. Willie Thrower from Michigan State
Yes.
was the first NFL black quarterback, and nobody knew that story. Jimmy Ray knew it, and that was one of the reasons he trusted Michigan State to give him a chance. I want to go back to Gideon Smith and get your comments on this. I had a podcast with Gideon Smith's grandson, and he made an interesting comment to me. He said that we tend to focus on one or two individuals, what Jesse Owens did at the Berlin Olympics, what Jackie Robinson did breaking Major League Baseball color line, and Joe Louis in boxing. And of course, those are great stories and great moments in American history. But Gideon's grandson made the point, all of these guys, Wilmuth, Sadat Singh, Bob Grant, Jerry Levias, Warren McVeigh, Jimmy Ray, Michigan State's black players, they had to overcome the same kind of prejudices. And that's why their stories are important for us to know and tell.
Yeah, I think without question, I'm focusing on the quarterbacks, talking about quarterbacks. But when we talk about Wilmuth Sidat Singh, who was not the first black athlete at Syracuse, but he was the first star black athlete. We've talked to people in the know, and they said, at the university, without Wilmuth Sidat Singh, there's no Jim Brown. And he was Jim Brown before Jim Brown, this two-sport athlete whom, Rick had mentioned about his basketball prowess, in talking to some NBA black pioneers who played with him, and Wilmuth played on the Harlem Renaissance, which was the greatest team in the world in the pre-NBA days. They said if he had continued on with basketball, he would have been in the Naismith Hall of Fame for basketball. But anyway, the point is that, and Rick and I were friends with Floyd Little, three-time consensus All-American, tremendous person. And Floyd told stories of, the racism that he had to deal with, when they went down to play bowl games in the South. The colored-only fountains, the colored-only restrooms were still there. The signs were still there. Ernie Davis, obviously, what he had to deal with. And he dealt with it in a different, more quiet way than Jim Brown. Jim Brown was in your face. I'm not gonna tolerate this. And so it was, all these people, the current day black athletes, and that was basketball and football. Again, they all stand on the shoulders of Wilmuth Sidat Singh. It can be traced back to him at Syracuse University.
Yeah. Let's move back to Sam Lacey, because you have a very interesting chapter where Brianna interviews him. And Sam talks about the criticism he got from the black community for exposing Wilmuth Sidat Singh. Talk about that chapter and the importance of highlighting it.
Well, one point, is that many members of the black community knew that Sidat Singh was black, and they were coming to that Maryland game to see him because that was vindication that a black player could make it in college football. Lacey's action ultimately leads to Sidat Singh not playing. And so you have this mixed reaction of tell the truth, or this dichotomy, tell the truth, is he black or is he Indian? And will we get to see him play or will we not? And ultimately the truth got told, but then people were denied that chance. And there was no TV at the time, so it's not like you could catch him next week in a televised game.
And we talked about this being a historical novel, but it's fiction, but it's based on nonfiction. And a lot of this was from Sam's own book, talking about the blowback that he received from the black community. And as Rick mentioned, it was well known. He was like Wilmot Sadat Singh was known from his days, even playing at DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, which was a powerhouse basketball program. So he was well known. And the black community knew why Wilmoth was doing this. Like, why are you playing along with this ruse? Because I'm going to play the game. I'm getting my sheepskin, And so he goes, they're going to use me. I'm going to use them, to get my education, and so forth. So, but Sam Lacey is a very fascinating figure. I've done a lot of writing for the Baseball Hall of Fame, and some of it's been on the impact of the black newspapers, the historically black newspapers. And, I saw like in that great movie 42 about Jackie Robinson and the role that Wendell Smith played in terms of not only, being an advocate, but being a shoulder to cry on, in a lonely world that he was thrust upon into. But Sam Lacey, going back to his days, he and Wendell Smith and a number of other prominent black sports columnists, they were banging the drum for integration throughout America, and all the black newspapers were as well, not just sports. But as early as the early 20s and stuff, Sam Lacey is writing columns about and talking to Griffith, the owner of the Washington Senators, about you'd be a lot better team if you had, some of my brothers on your team, and stuff like that. So they were banging the drum hard for integration in all aspects of American society way back when. And so for Sam Lacey, this was just another example of exposing racism and exposing the hypocrisy, with the white administrators of these universities, and how you're more than willing to make the money off of this man who's putting fannies in the seats for your, making your program successful and so forth, but you don't want to give him full citizenship or rights or whatever. Yeah. And in this case, denying him. So he did receive a lot of really serious criticism from the black community. I mean, the letters to the editor of his newspaper were very, very harsh. But as Sam Lacey pointed out, your anger is misdirected.
Right.
You should be upset with the coaches and the athletic directors and the chancellors of these universities who've made these policies. You got the wrong target here. You're coming after the wrong person here. Yeah. And he was right.
Yeah, but that's always the case when you expose the truth. And for our younger audience, you mentioned the Washington Senators. George Preston Marshall was the owner of the Washington Redskins franchise, and he was the last NFL team to have a black player. And one of his comments was, "I'll sign a black player when the Harlem Globetrotters have a white player." That's how stupid this racism was back in those days. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the chapter about Marty Glickman. And for our audience, a little more background. Marty Glickman and Sam Stoll were Jewish runners, world-class sprinters. They were scheduled to run in a 400-meter relay, but this is the Berlin Nazi Olympics. And as was pointed out earlier, it was okay that Sadat Singh was Hindu, but he couldn't be black. Well, in Berlin, the United States track team officials decided it was okay for Jesse Owens to replace Marty Glickman and Sam Stoll and another one of the black runners. So it was okay for them to run in front of Hitler, but not two Jewish guys. It just shows you how absurd everything was. But you have the chapter on Marty Glickman where Brianna goes to interview him, and you pose Marty as regretting he didn't speak up more. in 1937. Talk about that.
Well, I think
And
that
let let me add this first, Rick, for our younger audience. Marty
yeah,
Glickman was a nationally famous sportscaster based in New York, but he was well known. Everybody knew who Marty Glickman was.
yeah, he ultimately Syracuse becomes very famous for developing sports broadcasters, Marv Albert and Bob Costas and Mike Tirico, and they all stand on the shoulders of Marty Glickman, who will become, the great New York City sportscaster. But, to tie this back in its own small way to Duffy Daugherty, Duffy sees what happens in that locker room, and I think that the shame that Glickman will feel in later in life is that on that day in that locker room in that closed setting where only so many men are sitting around, the benches, hearing the coach say that we're not going to play Sadat Singh today. You can almost imagine that Duffy would have looked over at Marty, because Marty had been the victim of it and would have been with his eyes imploring Marty to say something, because Marty had power in so much as he was an Olympian, and Marty, to his death, to his dying day, greatly regretted that he didn't stand up that day in the locker room and challenge the coach or the athletic director about a decision that was being made about a fellow teammate. And while it scarred Marty in ways that, he cries on camera during a documentary that was done on his life, I think you can be sure that Duffy Daugherty felt that in a way that allowed him to say, if I stay in football and go up through the coaching ranks, this will never happen on my watch. And I think, to the point that you've been such a great researcher of Duffy's career and life, it doesn't happen on Duffy Daugherty's watch.
And the media never asked him about why he was changing the face of the game. This goes back to the media avoiding race. I guess the tipping point would have been the 1968 Mexico City Olympics with Tommy Smith and John Carlos protesting. Then you could no longer avoid it. But certainly in team sports, they weren't going to write about black athletes. They'd write about Joe Louis, Jesse Owens, and Jackie Robinson, and that was about it. In 1964, Michigan State, the first fully integrated rosters, and by that I mean double-digit black players, they go down to North Carolina and play at Kenan Stadium. It's the first time a fully integrated team has played in the South. Not a word was written about it in the media. The only thing that was said was the first time a Big Ten team played in North Carolina. So that's why all this stuff has got lost to history. And if you go read my books and go on my website, you'll see how the USC-Alabama 1970 game was backed in to fill that void that Scott talked about earlier. And people accepted it. And Duffy Daugherty and all his players and all these other brave 1960s pioneers who were, but it's oftentimes the only black player on the team when they desegregate a Southern school. They're lost to history, and all of them are more important than Bear Bryant and Sam Cunningham. And by the way, this is not criticism of Sam Cunningham. I like to point that out. Sam was used as a pawn by the USC guys who made up this myth. They were trying to sell a movie, and Sam came to realize that before he died. That's a whole nother story that you can read about on my website.
Well, Scott and I, Tom, would be remiss if we didn't bring up the fact that Ernie Davis becomes the first black winner of the Heisman Trophy, and does that in the early 60s. And I think that helps Duffy in his own way. And he would have had a pride that a Syracuse guy was again the first.
Yeah. And by coincidence, Ernie was in New York to get his Heisman the same day President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, was giving a speech at the Waldorf Astoria. And when he learned that Ernie Davis is in town, he wanted to meet him. And so they brought him together, and there's a famous photo of them shaking hands. And I always believed, the 1966 game, there's a half dozen games of the century labels. The 1966 one was the first one with black players. Duffy had 20 black players, 2 black team captains, 11 black starters, and Jimmy Ray is the South's first black quarterback to win a national title. Notre Dame had 1 black player, Alan Page, and that wasn't unusual. USC doesn't deserve any credit for leading integration. Their 62 team that won the national title only had 5 black players, and their 67 team that won the national title only had 7. So they were following that unwritten quota. You got to work hard in Los Angeles, populous and diverse, to keep your numbers that low. But the point I'm trying to make here is if President Kennedy had lived, I believe he would have attended that game of the century because he would have known, he would have recognized what a milestone game this was. But the sports media, again, they basically ignored it. Chris Schenkel was the broadcaster. He mentioned Bubba Smith was from Beaumont, Texas. Didn't say a word about him riding the Underground Railroad, segregation in the South that escaped. Dan Jenkins, everybody's hero as a sports writer, the godfather of sports writers, covered the game for Sports Illustrated. And his only description of Jimmy Ray, there's only 2 black quarterbacks in college football that year, major college football. His only description of Jimmy Ray was he had a mustache. So this is, and I bring this up for our younger audience to understand how little was known about what was going on about these pioneers. Let's move on. One of the things I've also brought up is that Duffy Daugherty's 1954 staff had included Dan Devine, who went on to Arizona State, Missouri, and Notre Dame, Bill Yeoman, who desegregated Houston, and Bob Devaney, who recruited more black players at Nebraska, and Sonny Grandelius. Frank Cush Dan Devine took Frank Cush with him to Arizona State, and Frank took over. All these guys followed Duffy's blueprint of not following the quota limits and recruiting more black players than they inherited. Dan Devine had 2 black players at Missouri in 1958. You don't ever hear about that. And then Bill Yeoman desegregated Houston's program in 1964. And I had his son, Bill Yeoman Jr., on a podcast, and they were so close. It was like talking to Bill Yeoman. It was so interesting. And I mentioned to Bill that, Houston has a statue of Bill Yeoman, deservedly so. Nebraska has a statue of Bob Devaney, deservedly so. 2 national titles. Dan Devine has a statue at Notre Dame. And people don't realize this. Vegas Ferguson, the All-American on that 77 national title team, he helped me with the research. Vegas Ferguson's freshman class in 1976, recruited by Dan Devine, there were 10 black players. That was the most ever at Notre Dame history for a freshman class. It's not that long ago. And then Barry Switzer didn't coach with Duffy, but he was a great admirer of Duffy. And so he has a statue at Oklahoma, deservedly so. And I asked Bill Yeoman, what would his dad think that all these guys have statues and Duffy doesn't at Michigan State? And he said he would be embarrassed for Duffy. And I bring that up because they have honored Wilmoth at Syracuse. They have his jersey hanging in the Carrier Dome. There's a statue of Ernie Davis, which there should be. What would Wilmoth think about Michigan State not honoring Duffy the way they should? And I want to add this too. Well, go ahead and answer that question. Then I got one more.
I'll go first, and I'll go really quick. Scott has long said that, had Sadat Singh lived and not been killed during World War II, that great things were in his future. And the fact that Kennedy had met him, it's very possible that Sadat Singh would have gone into politics, possibly with help from Kennedy. And he would have also been a voice of recognition because of what he had achieved for the people he had been with. And one of the most obvious people would have been Duffy Daugherty. So I think Singh would have been an advocate for his brothers on those Syracuse football teams. And Marty Glickman would have certainly probably played Sadat Singh up on his broadcast. So I think there's a lot of upside that history doesn't allow us.
Rick?
Syracuse alums. And I feel that, they retired the number. They got the wrong number, by the way, retired, but, and hopefully they'll correct that someday. but that there's had not been enough recognition for Wilmot Sidat Singh on campus. I would prefer, I haven't discussed this with Rick yet, but there are 2 new dormitories being built, and one I would like to see named for him. There is one named for Ernie Davis.
Yeah.
So maybe they'll think that's overkill with sports. And the other person would be Eileen Collins, the astronaut, a Syracuse alum who was, involved in some of the most historic shuttle missions of all time, being the first female pilot, first female commander, and also after one of the tragedies, like to get NASA back on its feet. But anyway, I look kind of at it like, Wilmoth, you throw the pebble in the placid pond and you get all these ripples. And so Wilmoth, I think that impact that he had on Duffy was profound. I really do.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that Duffy wouldn't have done the right thing or whatever, the courageous thing. But it had to have an influence on him to see, like, why are you treating people like this? Like, why? It makes no sense. It's wrong. And we've got to stop thinking, in these terms, like, judgments based on the things that don't matter, that shouldn't matter, I should say.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up about if Wilmoth had lived, because I think he would have maybe, as you said, if he had got into politics or become a prominent national figure, I think he would have shined a light on what Duffy was doing at Michigan State. We didn't talk about Wilmoth as a Tuskegee Airman. And of course, his death in a training accident crashed into Lake Huron. Tell us about that.
Well, we think that there's at least a possibility, and I'd say a strong possibility that the Tuskegee Airmen were obviously dealing with racism, and when they were sent to a base in Michigan, there's pretty good evidence that the base commander was racist, and there's that chance that Sidat Singh, being the most famous of the Tuskegee Airmen, could have been given a damaged airplane to fly. We don't know that for a fact, and you can't really go out that far on the limb to suggest that that Singh was murdered. But I think that it's very unusual that it is only Singh's plane that develops the problems that it does, and it crashes into Lake Huron. And ultimately, though, Sidat Singh will be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and he will be featured on U.S. war bonds. And so he lives on in slightly different ways, but it's the Tuskegee Airmen faced an awful lot of resistance in their coming to be, and then in them being allowed to fight and die for our country.
I had a chance to, while we were researching the book, I had an opportunity to talk to 2 Tuskegee Airmen who were being honored. They were trying to make up for lost time, and they were going all over the country to honor these guys at warplane museums and bases and so forth. And so I had an opportunity to talk to 2 gentlemen, and they, I was obviously talking to them about Wilmoth and how he influenced them. He was such a big hero in the Black community that they had a spike in enrollment after he joined the 3rd class of Tuskegee Airmen, and they were pumping those classes out real quickly during World War II. I mean, but anyway, they did talk about, and I've heard this read this, from other Tuskegee Airmen, that we often felt as if we were fighting 2 enemies, the Nazis and Japanese, and our own people. They were. There's a great quote from Marty Glickman. When he's really, struggling with his inability to stand up and stick up for his friend, and haunted by that. And he was talking about that Maryland game that they weren't allowing him to play in, and he said, Wilmoth was good enough to play, was good enough to die for our country, but wasn't good enough to play for Maryland. And I think, I mean, they had, they were 3/5 citizens back then, voting rights and all these different things. And yet they played such a dramatic role in helping us win World War II. And these were the best and brightest of Black America and of America. These were college graduates for the most part, who were willing to put their lives on the line for a country in which they were not granted full citizenship.
Yeah. And the other thing that I always say in my books and research and website and podcasts, it's a failure of the sports journalism world that they did not properly cover these Black pioneers all the way through Duffy's teams in the 1960s. And it's a failure of the modern sports journalism that they're not interested in telling these stories. They're comfortable with the Bear Bryant, Sam Cunningham story, and they keep regurgitating it. It was in the Atlantic just in May that this was a tipping point. And it's an injustice. That's my point. It's an injustice to Jerry Levias and all these other guys. They're the ones who did the dirty work. So let's wrap up with final comments. You want to go first, Rick?
Well, just greatly appreciative, Tom, of you having us on the podcast and giving us a chance to, I guess, promote our book, Invisible No More, which I think is available online. And we think is a really great look back at college football and the Tuskegee Airmen. And just thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. Scott?
Yeah, I just echo Rick's comments again. Just as you're carrying the torch for Duffy Daugherty, we feel in a lot of ways we're trying to carry the torch for this forgotten hero, and we just want to get it out to as wide an audience as we can, and do give him the historical due that he deserves. So we really appreciate any forum and appreciate the time you've given us. And again, I don't think there's any question that he had a profound influence on one Duffy Daugherty, without question.
Right. Yeah.
And Tom, if we get our book turned into a feature film, you can be sure we'll make sure that Duffy Daugherty has a prominent part in the movie.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to add about Duffy before I sign off here is Duffy always told his players, you got to have a funny bone. You got to have a sense of humor. You got to have a wishbone. You got to dream big. And you got to have a backbone to overcome adversity. And so I think that all of that applies to Wilmot Sadat Singh in his great life. All right. Thanks for watching the Endgame. Share this with as many friends as you can. It's the true story of college football integration.